My son stood in the doorway of the den I had built with my own hands and said, "Sign the power of attorney, Dad, or we'll go to court and have you declared incompetent." He said it calmly, the way a man does when he's been rehearsing the line for weeks. His wife, standing just behind his left shoulder, didn't even flinch. I looked at my son's face, the face I had watched grow from a red-wrinkled newborn to a 43-year-old man in a pressed Oxford shirt, and I felt something inside me go very still. Not broken. Still. I picked up my coffee mug from the side table, took one slow sip, and said, "Let me think about it." That was the last mistake he ever made. He thought my silence was surrender. He had no idea it was a blueprint. My name is Robert Hayes. I am 71 years old. For 34 years, I worked as a structural engineer for a firm in Phoenix, Arizona, designing buildings that are still standing and will be standing long after everyone in this story is gone. I retired 11 years ago, 2 years after my wife, Margaret, passed from ovarian cancer. I have one son. His name is Derek. For the first 8 years after Margaret died, Derek and I had a decent relationship. Not close, exactly. He was always more his mother's child, softer in ways I didn't always understand, but decent. We had dinner twice a month. He called on my birthday. His wife, Vanessa, was polite in the way that people are polite when they are tolerating you for someone else's benefit. I didn't hold it against her. I had my routines. I had my life. The trouble started 18 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as trouble at the time. Derek suggested I sell my house in the Arcadia neighborhood and move into their guest suite. "Just to simplify things, Dad," he said. "You're rattling around in that big place alone. It's a lot of house for one person." I told him I appreciated the thought and that I was perfectly comfortable where I was. He let it drop. Or I thought he had. 3 months later, I noticed small things. Derek started asking careful questions about my finances during our dinners. Nothing aggressive, just gentle, probing curiosity dressed up as concern. "How's the investment account doing? Have you thought about a financial advisor? You know." The word senior was always delivered with a slight pause before it, as if it were a diagnosis. Then Vanessa began texting me links to assisted living communities in Scottsdale. Lovely photos of smiling older men playing billiards and women arranging flowers in sunlit common rooms. Always accompanied by the same message, "Just wanted you to know what's out there." No pressure. I deleted each one and did not reply. The afternoon everything changed. I had been working in the backyard, clearing the oleander hedge that runs along the south wall. My neighbor, Pete Kowalski, was doing the same on his side of the fence. Pete is 68, a retired machinist who still has the handshake of a man half his age. We have been neighbors for 22 years. He handed his hedge clippers to Margaret at her last Christmas party and told her she was the only woman he'd ever let boss him around in his own yard. She had laughed until she cried. That memory alone is enough to make me trust him with anything. Pete set down his clippers and looked at me over the fence with an expression I had come to associate with information he wasn't sure he should share. He said, "I need to tell you something, Robert, and I want you to hear me out before you say a word." I put down my own clippers and leaned against the fence post. He told me that 2 Tuesdays prior, while I was at my cardiologist's annual follow-up, a sedan had pulled up in front of my house. A woman got out carrying a tablet and a professional-looking portfolio. She spent 40 minutes walking the perimeter of my property and photographing the detached garage, the lot line markers, and the secondary parcel behind the main house. The one Margaret and I had purchased in 1998 as a long-term investment, 3/4 of an acre in a neighborhood that had since become one of the most sought-after corridors in the greater Phoenix area. The woman, Pete said, had been met at the curb by Derek. He had walked with her the entire time, pointing, explaining, nodding. At one point, Pete had heard Derek tell her the occupant was an elderly widower with no other heirs. I stayed very quiet while Pete finished. I watched a hummingbird work the orange blossom at the corner of the yard, its wings a blur of purposeful effort. When Pete was done, I thanked him. He put his hand on my arm, the grip of a machinist, and said, "Tell me what you need, and I'll do it." That was all. Men who have known each other long enough don't require more. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table where Margaret and I used to do the Sunday crossword. I thought about everything I knew and everything I didn't yet know. The request for power of attorney that Derek had floated once before, mentioned casually over grilled salmon, and then withdrawn when I changed the subject. The assisted living brochures. The questions about finances. The appraiser walking my secondary parcel while I sat in a waiting room reading a magazine. None of it was accidental. All of it was architecture. My son had been designing something, and he had not bothered to invite me to review the plans. The next morning, I made a phone call. Her name was Carol Whitmore. She had been Margaret's estate attorney, and later became mine. She was 60, direct, and had the particular genius of making complicated legal concepts sound like plain good sense. I told her everything from start to finish without editorializing. When I finished, there was a pause on the line that I recognized as the sound of a very sharp mind shifting into gear. She told me the following. An appraisal of the secondary parcel without my knowledge or consent was not illegal, but it was telling. If Derek was building a case for guardianship, an appraisal would be an early step in establishing the asset value he intended to control. The legal threshold for guardianship in Arizona required demonstrating that an individual lacked the capacity to make reasonable personal and financial decisions. It was not an easy bar to clear for a mentally sound adult. But, Carol said, it was not impossible if a well-organized family member was willing to pay for the right doctors and the right documentation, and if the target was caught off guard. She asked me one question. Do you want to fight this in court? I told her no. I wanted it to be over before it started. She said, good. Here's what we're going to do. The secondary parcel had been purchased jointly. When Margaret passed, full ownership had transferred to me via the survivorship clause in the original deed. It was mine, free and clear. Current market value, based on comparable sales in the corridor over the past 18 months, was conservatively between $1.1 and $1.3 million. Carol said she had a colleague, a commercial real estate broker named James Okafor, who worked exclusively in private, off-market transactions. No MLS listing, no public record until the deed transferred. James moved properties quietly, quickly, and with absolute discretion. She also recommended I begin a medical documentation process immediately. A voluntary cognitive assessment with a neurologist of my choosing, establishing a dated, professional record of my mental fitness. If Derek had already enlisted a doctor to evaluate me in absentia, I needed a louder, cleaner counter-record. I agreed to both. What I did not tell Carol, because I had not yet fully processed it myself, was what I had found that same morning in the drawer of my own desk. After Pete's conversation, I had gone through every piece of mail I had set aside unopened over the past 2 months. There is a particular kind of document that arrives in envelopes you don't want to open. The kind associated with medical bills and property assessments and legal proceedings. I had been putting them in a drawer, meaning to deal with them later. That is the luxury of living alone. No one else is watching the pile grow. In the 4th envelope, I found a letter from an Arizona law firm I did not recognize. It was addressed to me, but the return address was a Phoenix firm specializing, according to its letterhead, in elder law and estate conservatorship. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The summary was this. It had been prepared at the request of a concerned family member who had retained the firm to begin a preliminary assessment of whether a formal petition for limited conservatorship was warranted in my case. They would appreciate my voluntary cooperation with an independent cognitive evaluation at my earliest convenience. The letter was dated 6 weeks prior. 6 weeks. Derek had been running this play for at least 6 weeks before he ever looked me in the eye across a dinner table. I sat with that letter for a long time. I read it 3 times. Then I set it on the table, face down, and I allowed myself 2 minutes of the kind of grief that does not announce itself politely. The grief of recognizing that someone you raised, whose birth you wept over, whose scraped knees you bandaged on this very kitchen floor, had decided you were an obstacle to be managed, not a father to be loved, a problem to be solved. 2 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Carol back. She was not surprised by the letter. She said it confirmed the timeline and the seriousness of intent. She also said it gave us something useful, a documented record that Derek had initiated legal proceedings without informing me, which, depending on how the rest unfolded, could be relevant to a number of things down the road. James Okafor agreed to meet me 3 days later. He arrived at Pete's house, not mine, a detail I had requested. He was 55, a compact man with a calm, measured way of speaking that reminded me of the senior engineers I had admired most in my career. Men who had seen enough complexity to know that clarity was always the goal. He brought one folder. Inside was a single sheet with 4 names on it. 4 prospective buyers who had been actively seeking off-market commercial-adjacent parcels in the Arcadia corridor for more than a year. All 4 were cash-position buyers. All 4 had signed blanket NDAs as a condition of being on James's private network. He told me that based on recent comparable sales, the parcel would likely generate offers between 1.1 and 1.35 million. He could schedule a single private walkthrough on a morning of my choosing, when Derek and Vanessa were confirmed to be elsewhere. The entire process from accepted offer to closed deed could be completed in as few as 12 business days if we moved efficiently. There would be no sign in the yard. The listing would not exist on any public platform until the moment the deed recorded at the county. I told him I was ready to proceed. The morning of the walkthrough, I drove to the diner on Thomas Road where Pete and I had been having breakfast on the 3rd Saturday of every month since 2009. I ordered coffee and eggs and tried to read the sports section. Pete sat across from me and pretended not to notice that I hadn't touched my food. He talked about the Suns. He talked about the hedge. He talked about absolutely nothing of consequence for 45 minutes, which is one of the most generous things one person can do for another. My phone rang at 11:22. James's voice was the same as always. Calm. Precise. He told me the walkthrough had gone 38 minutes. The buyer, a developer named Simmons who was assembling parcels for a mixed-use project, had brought his silent partner and their architect. They had measured every line. They had photographed the lot from every angle. The architect had called it a critical piece in front of James, which James relayed to me without inflection, though I could hear in his measured tone that it was significant. "They've asked to make an offer," James said. Today, I set down my coffee cup. The offer came in at 1.28 million. All cash. No contingencies. Requested close in 14 days. Pete was watching my face. I must have given something away because he leaned forward and said quietly, "Good news?" I told him the number. His eyebrows went up, just briefly, and then he nodded once in the way of a man who believes in the principle that good work eventually finds its right price. "Margaret would say that's only fair," he said. I called Carol from the parking lot. She walked me through the acceptance process, confirmed the trust documentation was in order, and told me the wire transfer mechanics were already arranged. We accepted the offer before noon. I want to tell you what I did next, because it matters more than the number. 3 years before she died, Margaret and I had a conversation at this same kitchen table that I had replayed perhaps 1,000 times since. We were updating our estate documents, a process neither of us enjoyed, and she had said something I wrote down afterward because I didn't want to forget the exact words. She said that the only inheritance worth leaving is one that makes something possible for someone who couldn't otherwise reach it. Money in a family only multiplies what's already there, but money in the right stranger's hands can start something the world didn't have before. The Robert and Margaret Hayes Foundation for Skilled Trades Education. Carol helped me structure it as an irrevocable charitable trust. The mission was specific. Annual scholarships and tool grants for students enrolled in accredited trade and technical programs in Maricopa County. Welding, electrical, structural fabrication, the work I had spent my career depending on, the work that built everything around us that no one ever thought to name. I was the lifetime trustee. The principal was protected. I drew a modest annual income from the investment returns, enough to maintain exactly the life I had and wanted. The rest funded the scholarships. The principal itself was untouchable, unreachable, and legally beyond the reach of any conservatorship petition, present or future. Derek didn't know any of it until a Tuesday morning in November. Carol had advised me to allow the standard legal process to serve its purpose cleanly. 2 days after the deed recorded and the transfer was finalized, a certified letter was dispatched from her office to the law firm Derek had retained. It outlined, in precise and thorough language, the recent voluntary cognitive assessment I had completed, the results of which placed me in the 92nd percentile for men of my age across all evaluated domains. It attached the deed transfer documentation. It attached the trust formation documents. It concluded with a single paragraph that I had asked Carol to include verbatim. It read, "Mr. Hayes wishes to make clear that he is aware of all actions taken on his behalf without his knowledge or consent, including the preliminary conservatorship assessment initiated 6 weeks ago, and the unauthorized appraisal of his secondary parcel conducted while he was absent. He has retained full documentation of both. He considers the matter of his estate entirely resolved and encourages all interested parties to govern themselves accordingly." Pete told me about the scene at my house afterward. He had been trimming the hedge. He saw Derek's car pull up fast, parked crooked, which Pete noted was uncharacteristic. Derek got out alone, no Vanessa. He stood on my porch and rang the bell twice. I opened the door. I had been expecting him. I had made a fresh pot of coffee. I offered him a cup. He didn't want it. He stood in the entry hall where Margaret's watercolor of the San Juan Mountains still hung, slightly tilted the way she had liked it because she said perfectly straight art looked like it belonged in a bank lobby, and he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was 8 years old and had been caught in a lie he hadn't prepared a good enough story for. "The land," he said. "You sold it." "I did," I said, without telling me. I looked at my son carefully. I wanted to be very precise about what I said next, because some words, once spoken, cannot be unsaid, and I had no interest in burning more than was necessary. "Derek," I said, "you hired a law firm to evaluate whether your father was mentally capable of managing his own affairs without telling me. You arranged for a professional to appraise my property while I was at a doctor's appointment. You have been building a legal case to take control of my finances for at least 6 weeks. I didn't tell you about the sale for the same reason you didn't tell me about any of that." He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at the floor and then back at me. The prepared argument, whatever it was, had not survived contact with the truth, stated plainly. "The money," he started, "is in a trust," I said, "named for your mother. It funds scholarships for trade students in Maricopa County. It has been doing so since last Friday." Something moved across his face that I couldn't entirely read. Anger, yes, but underneath it, something softer. Something that looked almost like recognition, like a man catching a glimpse of himself in a window he didn't expect to be reflective. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said, and his voice was quieter now. "Neither did you," I said. We stood in the hallway for a moment that felt longer than it was. The house was very still. I could hear the clock Margaret had wound every Sunday morning, still marking its patient time in the den. I told him I wasn't interested in a legal battle. I told him the conservatorship petition was moot and that Carol had communicated as much to his attorneys. I told him that if he and Vanessa chose to involve themselves further, Carol had documentation that would make that process more difficult and more public than either of us would enjoy. And then I told him something I had not planned to say, something that arrived in the moment without preparation. I told him that his mother would have been heartbroken. Not angry, heartbroken, because she had believed, right up until the end, that the two of us would take care of each other. That was the only inheritance she had really cared about passing on. Derek left 20 minutes later. He didn't slam the door. He closed it quietly, which somehow felt like more of an ending than any dramatic exit could have been. I went back to the kitchen and poured myself the cup of coffee I had made and not drunk. I stood at the counter and looked out the window at the yard Margaret had designed. The Meyer lemon tree she had planted the year we paid off the mortgage, the roses along the south wall that still bloomed every March, as if she had personally arranged it with them. I thought about a kid I didn't know yet, somewhere in Phoenix, in a high school shop class or a community college welding program or an apprenticeship they weren't sure they could afford to finish. A kid who would open a letter one day and find out that someone had believed in the value of what they were learning, that someone had decided the work of their hands mattered, that an old engineer and his wife, who had met in a college drafting class and spent 50 years building things that outlasted both of them, had arranged for that belief to continue past their own lifetimes. I think that is what winning actually looks like. Not the number in a transfer document. Not the look on someone's face when they realize the leverage they thought they had was never real. It is the quiet act of turning the ugliest moment in your family's history into someone else's best day. It is building something on the ruins of something that tried to take everything from you. I am 71 years old. I live in the same house I have lived in for 27 years. I have a neighbor who brings me terrible coffee and excellent company 3 Saturdays a month. I have a doctor who tells me my heart is stronger than it has any right to be. I have a foundation in my wife's name that has already awarded its first 3 scholarships. I have my drafting table in the den, still angled exactly the way I like it. The pencils in the same drawer they have always been in. I have everything I need. And Derek has something too, whether he knows it yet or not. He has a father who, when given every reason to cut the rope, chose instead to leave the door unlocked. He will have to decide what to do with that. I cannot decide it for him. Some structures a man has to build himself, from the foundation up, with his own hands, one honest piece at a time. His mother knew that better than anyone. She was right about most things. If someone in your life is treating your love like a resource to be managed rather than a gift to be honored, know this. The most powerful response is not the loudest one. It is the most prepared one. Protect what you have built. Protect it on paper, in trust, in the clean ink of a legal instrument that says, "This is mine and I choose how it continues." And then choose to continue it in a way that is worthy of the life you actually lived. If this story touched something in you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And let me know in the comments, have you ever had to quietly protect something you built from someone who should have cherished it? I read every single one.